So at this point, we're ready to have put in our sleeves. I've already done so. Now, I did them a little differently. The pattern actually calls for you to put in your zipper and do all of your hem and everything first and both side seams. However, I find that with some set-in sleeves like this, it can be easier to go ahead and put them in while you have this side seam open, like this. So you go ahead and you still are going to have it inside out if you're using a form, and even if not, it's going to be right sides to right sides. I have already turned under and slip stitched my seam allowance so that it will be smooth when you flip this over, and that will be the way that the seam is on the shoulder. It's still going to make a perfectly set in sleeve. It's just going to reduce that puckering that you have sometimes when you run it through your machine, getting through that round armhole. So when you go ahead and put in your zipper, what you will do is you will stitch from the end of your sleeve. Now I am again doing the 3/4 length sleeve. If you're doing the short sleeve, it's still the same from where you're going to put in the hem to about 2 inches where the mark is at underarm, and then put in your zipper. I do recommend putting in your zipper before you do this other side seam. However, you can go ahead and pin it if you'd like to see how it will fit and make sure everything's good. Now also, I've already gone through and put in my facing and stitched that down. Now this part here, what can be a little tricky, you want to put your facing in first, then this flap comes over and tucks under to cover that. It does pinch it down a little bit, but I'll flip this right side out and you can see how that lays in just a moment. So here the top is right side out, and as you can see, this right pleat section comes over and just tucks under, and you do have that little open keyhole. Now the pattern doesn't tell you to slip stitch this down in any fashion. However, I find that turning those raw edges in and slip stitching it just makes for a little bit of a nicer finish if you're doing all the handwork anyways. What's a few more inches? And as you can see, this set-in sleeve looks beautiful done this way. You have no pullouts that you need to do for if that sleeve gets pinched or anything when doing it. Now for myself, with this kind of fabric that's very thin, it's a little easier to do a sleeve this way because you don't run the risk of then ripping the very light weave. So it also can make it a little bit easier and faster. You're not changing the seam allowance in any fashion. You're still going to have a 5/8 seam allowance within your seam, and then your regular seam allowance in your shoulder there. And again, for that left side zipper that goes in, you do want to just stitch your underarm seam to your notch, which is roughly about 2 inches from the armpit, and then you put in your zipper. Now you will be putting in your zipper before you stitch your side seams, because you do need to put in that bottom facing that will do this curve, which then also gives you that extra length that your front piece is going to need. I'm sure you have noticed by now that your front is just ever so slightly shorter than your back piece, and that extra adds when you put in the facing. You also should have done your turns for your button loops. Now my fabric didn't turn very well, so I chose to press it under much like a very thin binding and make my loops that way. That's also an option. You also want to make sure that you put in your stitching for your open here for this little keyhole again. So you do have a keyhole in the back and in the front. Now depending on what kind of buttons you might want to put, you may choose to do those little loops differently. You could do crocheted loops, you could do elastic loops. You don't necessarily have to do them as fabric loops. And again, it's the back loops that we're talking about at this point. And it just really is going to determine what kind of buttons you want to put. It does call for a 1/2 inch, but if you're doing something that's more decorative, you may need a little bit more give than what the woven fabric will give you. So you may want to do a little bit of a small elastic loop, or if it doesn't require much give and you want to add a little extra decoration, you could also do these out of a ribbon that would pop in color as well. So I hope that this helps you with putting in your sleeves at this point. Again, you can also wait to put them in when you've done your side seams and put them in the traditional manner that the pattern calls for. I just wanted to let you know that this is another way you can do this, and it still is completely fine. Now, when you do put in your sleeve, something to remember is that your sleeve has darts in it, and those darts should be towards the back. They're there to give you that ease in your elbow, so you just want to make sure that they are to the back and not at the front. They should be at the back side of your sleeve. So when you put in your sleeve, if you look and your darts are on the front facing the back with the smaller portion going towards the front, then you need to repin it. Check this before you stitch so that you don't have to rip out your shoulder seam. And again, that shoulder seam, when you do stitch that in, if you're finishing without using a serger and you want to make a very clean finish, you will do a turnover. Now you want to trim one seam, usually your sleeve seam itself, the excess, and use what is from the bodice portion to encase that, and it will go towards the sleeve, not towards the bodice, so that it is completely flat and gives that appearance, much like a man's dress shirt. This is also how you would do that, and it just makes a very clean, nice little finish. So I will be back when we have that zipper put in, and we can go from there. Hope that you enjoy.